The 2024 F1 season is over. And what a banger it was. 7 multiple race winners, a constructors title fight that went right down to the wire, a drivers title fight that existed for a little bit, and it leaves F1 in a beautiful position going into 2025 and looking forward into the future. However, for now it's time to reflect, specifically on our class of 2024, and find out who let themselves and their teams down and who rose to the top in my official Neil Bruce Formula One driver rankings. I've dusted off the suit to set the tone for what will be an incredibly formal breakdown of all the drivers who competed this season from 22 to 1st. Unfortunately, Jack Doohan and Ollie Behrman are missing out on this list due to them only competing on minor parts of the season. So without further ado, let's kick it off with number 22, who can be no man other than Logan Sargent. Logan was of course dropped by Williams before the Italian Grand Prix in favour of Franco Colapinto. He was one of 2 drivers this season to score 0 points. His best result was a P11 at the British Grand Prix, but ultimately it was just a season to forget for Logan Sargent, and it does see him without a drive for the future and probably his time in Formula One come to a close. It is unfortunate, but when you look at the stats, he was outperformed 11-2 by Alex Albon in the races that they competed in together. In qualifying sessions, if you add together sprint qualifyings and regular qualifyings, then he was outperformed 14-2. However, his one saving grace was that he managed to outperform Albon 2-1 in sprint races together. Woohoo! But yeah, quite frankly, no surprises there that Logan Sargent is 22nd. Up next, number 21 is none other than Lance Stroll for Aston Martin. Lance Stroll had a couple of great race weekends, specifically finishing P7 at the Canadian Grand Prix and the British Grand Prix. However, the rest of his season was not one to write home about, making far too many mistakes, culminating in the horror show that was his Brazilian formation lap crash that basically saw him being the laughingstock of Formula One. He scored a mere 24 points to his teammate Fernando Alonso's 70 points over the course of the season. The Aston Martin's car performance really dropped off throughout the season, so essentially Lance would have needed to put in some great performances at the start of the season, and he just didn't quite manage it. And the thing with Lance is all of the mistakes just seem to be so silly. Like the Brazilian Grand Prix, like hitting the back of Daniel Ricciardo after the safety car at the Chinese Grand Prix. He also just made a silly move at Qatar more recently as well. So overall, I can't put Lance Stroll any higher than 21st. Moving on now to 20th position, and that is Sergio Perez for Red Bull. I'm not going to be the first person to tell you that Sergio Perez has had a stinker of a season this year, and I probably won't be the last. He's been absolutely whitewashed by Max Verstappen this season. 23 races to 1 in terms of Grand Prix performance. When it comes to qualifying performance, if you add together sprint qualifying and standard qualifying, it has been 29-1 to Max Verstappen. Now, obviously, we'll come on to Max Verstappen a lot later in this video and what a great season he has had. So it doesn't benefit Sergio to have such a strong teammate to compare himself against. But there's been some incredibly poor mistakes in there. Also, just Perez's qualifying in general this season, it's just been catastrophically poor. He's been struggling to get through into Q2 at times. Q3 has been barely achievable by him in what was, for a large majority of the season, one of the top sort of 2 or 3 fastest cars. I'd say towards the end of the season, they were really struggling, and no surprise that Sergio was struggling at that stage. But it just is no surprise that he's looking like he's going to be out of a drive for next season. In most of the interviews that Sergio has given over the last couple of months, he has remained very confident that he would be in that seat for next year. However, after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, he did not seem so certain. I do think that the writing is on the wall, and we will talk about potential replacements as they come up in this list. But unfortunately, it does seem to be over for Sergio Perez in Formula One. At least for now. He might get the Cadillac drive, I'm not too sure. In P19, we have Sauber's Zhou Guanyu. Not an amazing season for Zhou. He is out of a drive for next year. Seems like he's going to be taking up the role of Ferrari reserve driver for next year. We may as well bring in P18 in this list right now as well, which is his teammate Valtteri Bottas. Now you might be thinking, hang on a second, Zhou scored points this season, he should be above Bottas. But to that I say no, because this is a rating for the entirety of the year, not just one race. And yes, Zhou did perform incredibly well to get points at the Qatar Grand Prix, but if you look at it over an entire season, specifically in qualifying, Bottas has been absolutely slapping him silly. It kind of reminds me of when George Russell and Robert Kubica were in that Williams car that just couldn't score a single point throughout the entire season, apart from one race where Kubica managed to get 1 point at the Hockenheim ring, and Russell got no points throughout the entire season despite dominating him in every single other weekend. Now, I'm not trying to say that this has been a whitewash similar to that, but I do just think that Bottas has had a better year overall. Feel free to disagree with me on that one, of course, and I'm sure I'll hear about it in the comments below. Of course, Valtteri, another driver to be off the grid for next year. It is a shame, but I do think it was time for a change at Sauber. He is another driver that's potentially on the list for Cadillac. There were rumours that he was going to be supporting Max Verstappen at Red Bull. I can't see that one happening, but it would be pretty cool to see Bottas back in a top car. I hope that this isn't the end for Bottas in Formula 1 because he has been an incredibly prolific driver in the past. It just hasn't been the case for him this season. Sauber have just had the slowest car for the majority of the season, so it's not that surprising that they both struggled, Zhou and Bottas. So P17 up next, another driver that is unfortunately off the grid for next season. It's Kevin Magnussen. Now, Kevin actually did manage to amass 16 points over the course of this season. His best result of the year was a P7 at the Mexican Grand Prix, which was definitely his drive of the year. However, when you compare him to his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, who we will of course talk more in depth about later, he got beaten 41 points to 16, which is quite a mammoth amount. In terms of race results where they were both driving in the car at the same time, it was 16-5 to Hülkenberg. And overall, I do just think that it is time for Kevin Magnussen to move on from Formula 1. It seems that he has received a drive for BMW in Le Mans, which is very cool to see. Also very much looking forward to see Ollie Behrman replacing him for next year. That should be an exciting driver lineup at Haas. But yeah, overall, not an amazing season for K-Mag, unfortunately. So on to P16 now. We have Liam Lawson. Now this one is probably a bit harsh on Liam Lawson. He did only compete in 6 races this season. If he had competed in more, then we would have had more to go off, but I have just rated him for those 6 races, in which Yuki Tsunoda did have a decent beating of him, I think it's fair to say. However, Liam Lawson does remain the current favourite for the Red Bull seat. Now, I'm personally not sure if he's done enough to show that he is the man to take up the mantle, take up the seat next to the likes of Max Verstappen. However, he did have a couple of good performances since coming in to the drive this year. He had P9 finishes in both the US Grand Prix and in Brazil, which showed good performances from him. However, in the Brazilian Grand Prix in particular, Yuki Tsunoda did outperform him in that respective race. But I think that amassing 4 points in 6 races is not too bad in an RB car that definitely wasn't that competitive. He did start to gain a reputation for being a little bit careless in battle with other drivers. Sergio Perez certainly wasn't happy about the maneuvers that he was making on him. But if you look at that on the flip side, the aggression and the fight seems to be there if he can bring forward that confidence into next year. Should he step up to Red Bull, then he should be one to watch next year, and it'll be cool to see another new driver gracing the top 4 teams. Now moving on to P15, we have another driver that only completed a short amount of the season, and that is Franco Colapinto. It's fair to say that Franco made absolute waves in the paddock when he jumped into that Williams car for the first time. The first few races were looking absolutely amazing from him, picking up points early on. However, as the time wore on and as he kind of embedded himself more into the sport, the mistakes started to show. Dropping it under the safety car at the Brazilian Grand Prix wasn't amazing. dropping it in qualifying for the Vegas Grand Prix, which caused him to start from the pit lane. Also not an ideal time for him. And it seems that he is now out of consideration for any of the drives on the grid for next season. When it comes to 2026, there's still a chance for him to get back in the grid, which would be cool to see because I think the raw pace is definitely there with Franco. He just needs the time to iron out these mistakes that he seemed to be making, which were rookie errors, and he was a rookie this season. It didn't help him that the Williams performance seemed to tail off towards the end of the season, whilst a few of the other teams were kind of gaining momentum, like the Alpine team, who with 6 races to go were similar on points to Williams, but ended up jetting up the table to P6 after that amazing result in Brazil that they had, and then they took the momentum from that onto the end of the season. So it was remaining difficult for Colapinto to get into the points with so many other teams up there. Moving on to P14 now, and it is my boy Daniel Ricciardo. I think I may have put Daniel Ricciardo a little bit too high on this list. It's probably just out of pure sentiment and the fact that I miss having him on the grid. It wasn't an amazing time for Daniel Ricciardo this season, of course getting dropped in favour of Liam Lawson as they were testing him out for the Red Bull seat for next year. So he missed the last 6 races of the season. Until that point, it hadn't been a flawless performance from Daniel Ricciardo, it's fair to say. He had, of course, the very high highlight of the Miami sprint race qualifying and finishing in P4, a truly sublime performance there. But the rest of his time in Formula 1 in 2024 wasn't amazing. Another driver that should be considered, I think, for the Cadillac drive in 2026, but unfortunately we won't be seeing Daniel Ricciardo on the grid for next season, and we obviously haven't seen him for a while. Now, my 13th best driver of 2024 is Esteban Ocon. I think that the sacking of Esteban Ocon, or at least the dropping of Esteban Ocon before the final race of 2024, is possibly one of the more disrespectful moves that a team has gone for that I've seen in Formula 1. He's the longest standing driver that Alpine have had in Formula 1. For them to just not allow him to have his farewell drive at the team is a little bit disappointing. And I actually think that Esteban has had quite an underrated season. He's not been hitting the heights of Pierre Gasly, who we will come on to in a little bit, but he didn't have a bad season, and specifically the drive at the Brazilian Grand Prix, coming home in P2, was an absolutely mesmeric performance from him. He obviously had that incident at the Monaco Grand Prix where he hit his teammate, and then he ended up getting dropped for the following season after that. The team just seemed to have had enough of him by that point. He's obviously picked up the Haas drive for next season, kind of replacing the outgoing Nico Hülkenberg, and it'll be interesting to see how he can get on there. He's obviously got a much more youthful teammate in Oliver Behrman. He should be expecting to be definitely asserting his dominance over the young Brit next year. In terms of Ocon versus Gasly for this year, when you look at Grand Prix results, he actually outperformed Gasly 13-10. When it comes to qualifying, if you add sprint race qualifying and regular qualifying, then he lost that battle 16-13. But it's definitely a lot closer than you might expect between him and Pierre. And of course, when Ocon was outperforming Gasly, which tended to be earlier on in the season, the Alpine was an absolute tractor of a car. They weren't getting anywhere near the points. I mean, remembering the opening race of the season, they locked out the back row of the grid. They had absolutely no pace. So it was kind of unfortunate that Esteban was doing all the good work whilst Alpine were so far down. And moving on now to P12 in my standings, and rounding off the first half of the drivers in this video, we have none other than Alexander Albon. Albon obviously decimated Logan Sargent when the two of them shared the Williams seats. Then when Franco Colapinto came in, it seemed like he was given a little bit of a scare. But when you look at Colapinto's best results, such as his P8 in Baku, Albon did manage to finish P7 in that race, so it's not like he was getting outperformed when Colapinto was at his best. He also had an incredibly bad run of luck, it seemed, towards the end of the season. But overall, finishing the season with 12 points in a Williams car that wasn't particularly competitive this season, it wasn't a bad time for Alex Albon. Of course, the main test for Albon will come next season when he's up against one of the top drivers in Formula One in Carlos Sainz. They'll definitely both be hoping that the Williams car takes a big step forward for next year, and if not then 2026. Because having a driver lineup that strong with a car that poor would be incredibly disappointing for both of them. So now on to the top half of the driver rankings. And let me just say that everyone from this point on has had a great season. I'm definitely going to make some people upset with how I have ranked them though. So P11 itself goes to none other than Yuki Tsunoda, just squeezing into the top half of my rankings. And I think that overall this has been a very strong season from Yuki Tsunoda. He's had two competitive drivers up against him in Daniel Ricciardo and Liam Lawson. He set both of them aside and I think shown what he needs to have to get that Red Bull seat for next year. His best performances of the season being P7 finishes in Australia, Miami and at the Brazilian Grand Prix, and we can't forget his Brazilian Grand Prix qualifying in which he managed to finish in P3. And as I say, I think that Yuki has shown enough this season to join Max Verstappen at Red Bull for next year. He's been consistent over the course of the whole season. The car hasn't been particularly amazing. You know, they did finish P8 in the championship standings, and he outperformed the car at times. He then beat Liam Lawson when he came in and was under pressure for the drive for next year. So yeah, I think that Yuki Tsunoda has had a very amicable season. So moving on to P10 now, we're into the point. It's none other than Pierre Gasly. Now, as I mentioned earlier on in this video, Gasly was outperformed by Ocon in terms of race head-to-head. However, Gasly definitely performed when it mattered most towards the end of the season, when the Alpine performance ramped up, and he managed to accumulate 36 points in the end this season. Obviously, like Ocon, having that amazing result in Brazil, finishing in P3, and then towards the real end point of the season, having amazing performances in both Qatar and Abu Dhabi in qualifying and the main race. And he ended up managing to secure P10 in the standings overall at the end of the season, which, when you consider how bad the Alpine car was at the start of the season, is really a triumph for Pierre. Of course, remaining with the team for next season alongside Jack Doohan, who we saw for that one race in Abu Dhabi, I firmly expect Pierre to continue this form into next season. He will probably decimate Jack Doohan next year, if we're all being honest. And it'll be interesting to see how Alpine get on in 2025. Obviously, they're making the switch to Mercedes engines for 2026, so I can't see their performance being particularly amazing next year because they'll probably be scaling back the investment into their engine division, but only time will tell on that one. P9 now, and we have Nico Hülkenberg. Now, I know I did just mention that Gasly managed to snatch P10 from Nico Hülkenberg at the end of the year. However, I do just think that Hülkenberg had a more consistent season overall. He was constantly in the tail end of the points, which unfortunately doesn't get you many, only 2 or 1 point a lot of the time. However, Nico was constantly dragging that car up into Q3. He was outperforming Kevin Magnussen consistently over the whole season. And in some ways, it's quite disappointing to see that he's going to be departing the team at the end of the year, considering the synergy that they had built up together over the course of the whole season. And of course, the Sauber performance over the course of this season being incredibly poor, we don't know how Nico is going to get on next year. Of course, the main focus for him, I'm sure, will be Audi coming into the sport in 2026. And that'll be when we really see a solid Nico Hülkenberg performance again. It's probably going to be quite a ropey 2025 for the German driver. His highlights of the season include P6 finishes at both the Austrian Grand Prix and the British Grand Prix. Back-to-back race weekends, finishing in the top 6 was incredibly impressive from Nico. Unfortunately, he had a couple of stinkers this year. The Brazilian Grand Prix, definitely one to forget for him. Getting beached on the curb outside of turn 1, ended up getting pushed back onto the track by the stewards and getting disqualified. but throughout the rest of the season, he showed incredible consistency. And now we move into probably the more contentious part of this video, the top 8 drivers. What I will say going into this one in particular is that I do believe that between 8th and 5th, all of the drivers are very interchangeable. It's incredibly close in this period of the video. But in my opinion, the 8th best driver in Formula 1 in 2024 is Oscar Piastri. Oscar, of course, got his first ever race wins this season at the Hungarian Grand Prix and in Azerbaijan, both incredibly good performances from the Australian driver. But when it comes to his performance over the whole season, it just seemed like he generally was lacking a bit of pace. Now, of course, he's up against Lando Norris, who I haven't yet mentioned in this video, and he will come later on. And Lando has been a very good driver over the course of this season, but he hasn't been without his mistakes. And Oscar has ended the season just over 80 points behind his teammate, which isn't a great result, I think it's fair to say. When you look at qualifying performance, if you add together sprint qualifying and regular qualifying performances this season, he was outperformed 25-5 by Lando Norris. Of course, one of Lando's big strengths this season has been qualifying. But when you look at main races, he was outperformed 16-8 in the head-to-head. And a lot of the discourse when it comes to McLaren this season is that it's generally believed that they had the fastest car this year. So for him to finish 4th in the championship and be only 2 points in front of Carlos Sainz in the end, it's not an amazing performance from him. And the other thing is that when people talk about Oscar Piastri, they generally are talking about the fact that if he were to be in a title fight with someone like Max Verstappen, then he wouldn't be making as many mistakes as Lando Norris did this year. However, he just doesn't quite have the pace to be talked about in that conversation yet for me. Obviously, it's only his 2nd season in Formula 1. So there's still a lot of development time that he will have going forward. I have no doubts in my mind that Oscar will continue to develop and become an even better driver than he already is. And 8th place on my rankings is still, as I say, a very good result. But I just think that this season maybe wasn't quite as good as some people might think for Oscar. Moving on to P7 in my rankings, we have Carlos Sainz. Carlos obviously picking up 2 race wins this season in Australia and in Mexico, both stunning drives really when you look at it. Obviously in the Australian Grand Prix, Max Verstappen was out of the race, so that kind of contributed to what was quite an easy win in the end for Carlos. But he did have to keep everyone else behind him. And when it comes to Carlos, obviously he knew coming into this season that he was already getting replaced by Lewis Hamilton for next year. So to have the resilience to come into this year, have obviously the big issue with his appendix getting removed at the start of the year, and then going on to win the next race, it really sent out a statement from Carlos Sainz that he is one of the better drivers, if not one of the best drivers on the grid. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier in the video, he is departing the team to Williams for next year. Quite a dramatic downgrade for him, it has to be said, especially with how Williams were performing towards the end of this season. You'd hope for Carlos's sake that they're going to make big steps forward in the coming years. And Carlos did drop a couple of stinkers this year, specifically in wet weather conditions. In the Canadian Grand Prix, he had an absolutely dreadful time. And then in the Brazilian Grand Prix, smashing into the wall. Not his finest moments. But I think overall, very strong pace from Carlos Sainz this year. He actually managed to take it to Charles Leclerc in a way that I don't think that many would have expected. Moving on to 6th place now, the final driver remaining who wasn't one of the top 4 teams in the Constructors' Championship this season. We have Fernando Alonso. When you look at the Drivers' Championship standing, it is hard to believe that Fernando is so far in front of Pierre Gasly in P10. When you look at Gasly's performances towards the end of the season, like, you'd expect them to be much closer together, but Alonso basically just picked up all of the points that he amassed this season in the first 6 races. When Aston Martin were strong, Fernando Alonso was incredible this season, and he really proved that he does still have it. It's just unfortunate that Aston Martin dropped back so severely throughout the season, Fernando coming on the radio to say that it was the worst car ever at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. And when it comes to teammate comparisons, you do obviously expect Fernando Alonso to demolish Lance Stroll, but he did do exactly that this season. Next season, we've got Adrian Newey joining the Aston Martin team in March. He should manage to make that team take a big leap forward, if not throughout next season, then definitely for the 2026 season. And it'll be great to see Fernando back in a good car. I'm hoping that he manages to stay fit for the 2026 season. He is obviously getting on in age now. But yeah, Fernando Alonso still showing that he is one of the best drivers in Formula One, and I've got him as my 6th best driver in 2024. We are really getting to the business end of the rankings now. My top 5 drivers in Formula One this season. Starting off with P5, it's Lewis Hamilton. Of course, Lewis's final season with Mercedes, the strongest driver and car pairing in Formula One history. I may as well bring in P4 in my rankings as well right now, which is George Russell. I think the Mercedes drivers generally have been incredibly close together this season, which is why I've got them in P5 and P4. In the car that only finished 4th in the Constructors' Championship, they both managed to win 2 races this season. Of course, George's races that he won, the Austrian Grand Prix and Las Vegas. Austria obviously coming to him somewhat on a silver platter with Lando Norris and Max Verstappen crashing into each other. However, it's argued that the Belgian Grand Prix should have been his to win. However, he did get disqualified due to the plank being too thin. And then Lewis obviously winning the British Grand Prix and the aforementioned Belgian Grand Prix this year. And if you look at their seasons as a whole, whilst they have been close together in finishing position, Russell has absolutely decimated Lewis Hamilton when it comes to qualifying performance. If you add together sprint qualifyings and regular qualifyings, Russell has outperformed Hamilton 24-6 this season. However, when you look at the end of season points tally, they are fairly close together. Russell finishing on 245 points, Hamilton on 223 points. And with Russell outperforming in qualifying, I think that the general consensus is that Hamilton has been outperforming Russell when it comes to race pace. Of course, points are scored on a Sunday. However, Hamilton has been generally starting a little bit too far back for his liking in terms of scoring the maximum points for this year. If you look at the final 3 rounds of the season, for example, Hamilton's qualifying really let him down there. Las Vegas in particular, if he had qualified at the front, he definitely had the pace to win that race. Abu Dhabi qualifying way too far back and then coming all the way through to overtake Russell on the final lap. If he had been further forward, then again, it could have been a better result for him. But the qualifying really did let him down. And looking forward to next year, Hamilton obviously departing to Ferrari, a massive switch up in the sport. Really can't wait to see how that goes with him up against Charles Leclerc. Russell obviously having Kimi Antonelli joining him at Mercedes. You would expect Russell to outperform Antonelli, but who knows what will happen there. One of the hottest prospects in Formula One right now. It will be super interesting to see how both the Mercedes drivers of this season get on next year. Okay, the serious business end now, the podium places of my rankings of the drivers this year, and they do reflect the top 3 in the championship this season. However, it does not follow the order of the championship this season, because in P3 I have Lando Norris. As I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about Oscar Piastri, Lando has made a fair few mistakes this season. In fact, I made an entire video about how many points Lando Norris has lost this season. You can watch that one after this one. But when you look at Lando's season as a whole, he was the only driver that had really a shot at challenging Max Verstappen for the title this year. It didn't end up transpiring, but Lando did show amazing pace this season, specifically in qualifying, where he managed to qualify on pole more than any other driver this season. However, when it came to lap 1 after qualifying on pole, he would always let himself down and start dropping down the order, unfortunately. But when you look at Lando's highlights of this year, you're looking at the Dutch Grand Prix, the Singaporean Grand Prix, and in Abu Dhabi at the final race of the season, where he had an astronomical lead over the rest of the championship. When he and that McLaren were hooked up together it was the fastest combination in Formula One this season. And Lando, after that final race, sending out the message on the radio that he was ready to fight for his own title next season after McLaren wrapped up the Constructors' Championship in Abu Dhabi. And I really hope for Lando's sake that he can iron out some of these mistakes that he was showing this season, because he is an incredibly fast driver and I think deserving of P3 in my rankings for this season. And now, the top 2 drivers on my list. I'm not going to try to create any suspense because you probably know how this is going already. In P2, I have Charles Leclerc. Leclerc has been incredibly consistent this season. Qualifying for him has really been where he's shone. He obviously won the races in Monaco and at the Italian Grand Prix this year, 2 very emotional victories for him. And anytime Ferrari were quick this season, it seemed like Charles Leclerc was on top of it. Obviously, Carlos Sainz did manage to win a couple of races this season over Leclerc, but Leclerc was always right behind Sainz in those scenarios where he did win. And I think that Charles showed the consistency this season that if Ferrari had a better car over the course of the whole season, then he would definitely be able to challenge Max in a title fight. And I'm really hoping that that's what we get next year. Charles had an absolute nightmare at the Canadian Grand Prix and the British Grand Prix this season. The strategy just getting absolutely chucked out the window by Ferrari on those days, essentially just going onto the wrong tyres at the wrong time in both of those races, dries on a wet track and wets on a dry track. However, every other race this season has been exemplary from Charles. And I think that he is deserving of the second best driver on the grid for this year. And that, of course, can only leave one man to be number 1, the best driver on the grid in 2024. No surprises, is Max Verstappen. I don't think that anyone can disagree with Max being the best driver on the grid this season. I did a similar video in which I analysed his points lost this season, like I did with Lando Norris. And what I found during the research for that video is that Max made incredibly few mistakes this season. The only mistakes that he made over the whole season really is hitting a bollard at the Miami Grand Prix, hitting Lewis Hamilton at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and then most recently in Abu Dhabi, spearing Oscar Piastri at the start of the race, which was a little bit out of character, I thought. But when it came to the title fight with Lando Norris that was sort of on for a little bit, he handled it absolutely perfectly. He made sure that Lando had absolutely no momentum building up for the last 2 races of the season. And obviously the Red Bull car dropped in performance as the season wore on. They had a very strong car at the start of the season, Max obviously winning 7 of the first 10 races. And then he was just managing the gap between him and the rest of the drivers throughout the rest of the season, and then picking up that amazing win at the Brazilian Grand Prix. One of the best wet weather drives in Formula One history, unsurprising from Max, who is, of course, stunning when it comes to wet weather conditions. And even though the car performance has dropped so dramatically throughout this season, and we're not sure how they're going to get on for next year, Max will always remain in the conversation for winning the title next year because of how strong he will perform and how he will always maximise the performance of that Red Bull. So that brings all of my rankings to a close. You can see them all on the screen right now from 22nd up into first. Please comment below how you would change my rankings. I'd love to get decimated in the comments. And yeah, with all that, that's 2024 wrapped up. Absolutely can't wait to see how everyone gets on in the 2025 season. Thank you guys so much for watching.